It's the Steve Jobs quote, isn't it? It's the, we don't hire the best people and tell them what to do. They tell us what to do.
The insanity of starting up your own business.
Yep.
Every founder has a whole set of resources at their hand, but if you had a founder's toolkit, what would be the tools that you'd have in there?
The first one is a bullshit detector.
The fact you're doing things that haven't been done before.
People are everything.
If you were to write a book, what would be its title?
To paraphrase Bill Clinton, it would be, "It's the people, stupid."
The time that you want to give up is the time when it's most important not to give up.
Welcome everyone, my name is Ross Tuffee and this is Founder.Scot, a series of conversations where I invite founders to share their insights, learnings and experiences of founding a business with me and of course with you. So if you're a founder yourself or thinking about founding a product or a company, or simply just want to understand more about that roller coaster that you might ride when you start a business, stay tuned. Hopefully over the next few minutes, we'll have something that will help you with your journey. I'm new to podcasting, so we've treated Founder.Scot as a new technology product. This means that what you'll see over the first few episodes is our first release or minimum viable product, MVP. It won't be perfect or indeed the finished article, but hopefully over the coming weeks, you'll be generous enough to tell us what you think. That's the good, the bad and the ugly. And maybe tell us more about what you want to see and how you'd like to see it. Please put your comments in the chat below and we really welcome feedback so we want to deliver to you something that is really useful. In my first two episodes, I speak with Allan Nelson, the CEO and co-founder of Foresight. Foresight is a solution that aims to embed the concept of data as a critical asset across the hospitality sector. More on that later. Allan has experience of founding 3 businesses as well as exiting one of them, and I'm really very much looking forward to our chat over the few minutes ahead. In the first episode, as well as understanding Allan's founding journey, we'll cover a few interesting topics that many founders find themselves dealing with, including how do you understand what the customer really wants, the importance of building a robust senior team, and what it means to work on the business, not in the business, and various ways that you might look to finance your business. You'll notice that this intro was recorded a little after the original recording. That's because we've been working on how best to present the incredibly valuable insights that my guests generously provide. Bear with us. Our ultimate aim is to provide you with a sub 20-minute episode stuffed full of useful hints and tips to help you on your journey. We will get there. Like all great products, our offering will evolve to meet our users' needs. But as any product development knows, it takes time, it takes iteration, and it takes lots and lots of user feedback. Right, let's get on with it. Allan, it's really great to have you here. Thank you for bearing with me through my long and rambling intro, and also for taking the time out of your business to share your thoughts and experiences with us.
Hi, Ross. Yeah, great to be here. I'm really looking forward to having a chat.
Great. So let's just start. Let's start chronologically in those sort of early days. How you led up to where you are today. Tell us a bit about the background there.
Yeah, it actually starts with my parents in Northern Ireland. My parents are English and moved to Northern Ireland in the 70s, which not many people did in those days for various historical reasons. And cut a long story short, they were both entrepreneurs. They together founded Northern Ireland's first advertising agency, which is still going today. And so I grew up in that kind of marketing technology environment. My dad was a massive technophile, and I kind of learned that from him. I've always loved making technology do things that it's never done before. So grew up in that environment. I went to university in being Northern Irish. Getting to 18, of course, I left Northern Ireland because a lot of us did at the time in the early 90s. And I went to Dundee University. So that was my, I've been in Scotland for nearly 30 years, and I did a history and politics degree. So it's a very different thing to possibly what a lot of people do when they get into technology. But graduated there, and then I arrived in a business in Edinburgh as part of my generation, and yours as well, obviously as well, Ross, is the Windows 95, 98 generation, what I would call it. So I arrived in fairly computer savvy and got hired in 1998. And I think I interviewed on the same day that Google got incorporated. I interviewed with my now business partner.
That's a milestone.
Milestone, and I joined a little company called Fourth Marketing Services. At the time was run by my now co-founder Richard Bolton, and they were a small agency doing very complex direct mail communications for big financial companies. And Richard, being a chartered accountant, rather than run an agency as a creative agency, which most were at the time, he ran it from a point of view of almost a data agency. Even though at the time I'm not sure they realised they were doing that, but he would project manage these big bonus statement, pension statement mailings for likes of Scottish Widows and Standard Life, and it just suited his mindset. And I got in there and got handed 6 network PCs and told, okay, well, you're going to run those, and you're also going to account manage our clients. To cut a long story short, within 2 years, I'd gone to Richard and said, look, all this data work that we outsource and do, I think we could do this in-house. We have broadband internet arriving. We have PDF technology arriving. Rather than us stand over a fax machine at 8 o'clock in the evening waiting for some proofs to come through from a printer, why don't we get the whole thing done as PDF? And it means we could send millions of these things up and down the country. We can move up the supply chain. So, and my dad and his best techie are coming out of their business in Northern Ireland. So my dad exited that business. Mum and dad exited that business. Actually, Mum retired. My dad, was needing something to do. They did a great 15 years, but the exit of the business was quite messy, and they kind of lost control of it. So for me, watching that happen was quite a lesson in itself. But in August the 20th, 2001, we incorporated what became Fourth Communication NI Limited, became our subsidiary company, and we loaded in about £250,000 worth of data processing work. So the company from the get-go had work to do, and it built up, we had an order book sitting there. We just moved up the supply chain. So that was kind of the first startup, but not, it wasn't, I didn't really know that we were on a startup journey. We were just doing something to me that was really, really logical, made complete sense to Richard, and I suppose was the foundation of a relationship that has lasted, 23 years. So we grew and scaled that business gradually over that next decade, the 2000s, and it's underpinned everything. It had underpinned everything that we did. So throughout that time, we've actually created two more. We actually created 2 more SaaS products within the business. The first one is Foresight, is the hotel product. In 2006, 2007, we got a phone call from a very, very famous Scottish 5-star resort who said, look, we hear you guys deal with name and address data and transactional data. We've got a data problem here, a data challenge as a marketing team. We want to be able to speak to our guests in terms of our mails or digital communications in the same way our concierges speak to them when they come through the door. We know we've got lots of good data in the systems because hotels by their nature do capture that level of data, but it's siloed into old systems and separate systems, accommodation, spa, golf, dining. The data's a mess. There's no single customer view. It's difficult for us to get at it because either IT are the gatekeepers or the vendors are the gatekeepers. Can you come in and solve this problem? And can you put it all together? Can you clean it up? Can you present it to us through a web browser so we can query it?
So retention is, you managed to retain all those. That's great. Yeah.
Retention is very good. And we've grown and evolved with them over the years. Now, at the time, 10 years ago, we took around what we thought was a product. In reality, it was a series of prototypes. We built this for them. What data feeds do you have? We'll make you one like it. So it was a series of copy and paste applications, which was a nightmare. But when we got to about the middle of last decade, we realized, oh, hang on a second, we've learned enough here. We take a very deep, rich set of data from these hotels. We know enough here to turn this whole thing on its head. So we standardized the inputs and the outputs. So we created at the time what we called V2, was actually V3, and so on. So we did that, scaled that a bit more over the last 5 or 6 years, and we're now on the V4 of the product, which is where we're moving the whole thing in, and we have moved a lot of it already into, we're using Azure APIs, microservices, all some really, really modern technology and methodology. So it's been a continual phase of evolution. So we were running that product within the wider business. We also had a third startup that mainly my business partner Richard worked on, which is an auto enrollment product called OptEnroll. That was an interesting journey for us in terms of the initial product that we built about 5 or 6 years ago was a much tighter, better working piece of software. We'd specified it better, we'd built it better because we'd learned from what we'd done or not done at Foresight. However, the interesting thing for us at the time and the learning was that because we've always been self-funded and we've always been in control of our own destiny, there's been times over the last 10 years we've probably not been that good at asking the customers what they actually want. And I think there's been times that we've built stuff that actually we think is a good idea for the market, but the market itself, had a different answer to that.
But it's funny because as we were talking there, up to that point, I actually thought you've taken quite a lot of time working with customers. Customers have come to you and asked you to do things, and that in itself is listening because you're responding to what a customer need is. But I guess and you're continually evolving that product, with listening. And even you spoke in the very early days. You said I was an account manager, which means you were right at the coalface, in that sense. So listening to customer. Maybe sometimes we step away from that. We get carried away on a journey, and maybe we need to keep looping back to the customer. But it's absolutely critical, isn't it?
100%. And I say we've probably been, over the years, I think we've been guilty on both counts, on both Foresight and OptEnroll, of just because we've never had a board of investors. We've never had people so it's always been Richard and myself and other colleagues in the business pushing ourselves forward, and then driven by clients in some cases, but otherwise driven by what we feel the market might take. The learning from that, quite simply, has been we now have a full product team in-house who are excellent, and they are very, very good at saying, no, we're going to talk to a customer first.
So that series of prototypes that you started with, which you thought was a business, and indeed was a business, but now that you know more about how to develop software, let's say now, over the last 5-6 years or whatever, you look back and you go, actually, these were a series of prototypes. We did need to get more connected with customers, and we've now set up a product team. So that product team spends its time looking at the customer, asking, what does that product team do?
It's a series of things. That they're obviously responsible for the overall roadmap. They're responsible for all the requirements that get fed into our development and our technology team, down to quite a level of detail. But but the requirements are very much for the focus of how will the user use the product, what do the customers want, what do they not want, why are they not using this bit of functionality that we've developed. So we're moving towards and have moved towards very much an agile MVP methodology, in that we'd rather release something small, see what the reaction is, and then change based on that. In previous times we may have taken a year to release something really big and then find out either it works or it doesn't. So it's about that change in mindset, and our head of product is very much driving that. She's very clear on how she wants to run it, and I'm very clear that I'm happy to empower her to do that.
How have you found that? Because that's an interesting one itself. I'm happy to empower her to do that. Often we find with founders who've set up a business and they've run that business from scratch, that it's quite hard to hand the reins over. Has that been easy or difficult?
Probably more difficult in the early days, and certainly when I think about myself and my co-founder, we're two quite different people, and I think it's been easier for me to do that. I'm always the one who's looking ahead 2 or 3 years. I'm always looking, okay, where do I need to be in the future? Where does the business need to be? What needs to happen to make us do that? My co-founder is the opposite of that. He's the I think we've been described very well in the past as I'm the accelerator, he's the brake. Okay. He would be more the one who would be more in amongst it and trying to get things done ourselves rather than hand stuff over. Where it was, part of my journey was, I think, 6-7 years ago when we came to that middle of the decade, I came to a crossroads in my career. I could either sit and keep building this product, working with a small bunch of clients, or I had to make a change. And it got to the stage in the business that we needed to make that change. We actually needed to prove that Foresight had more of a market than just the clients that we had. Yeah. So after a series of fairly frank conversations with him, he said to me, look, we're big enough now, forget about building a product, forget about managing developers, forget about all of this, forget about the admin side of the business, I can deal with that. You just have to go out into the market, and you have to talk to the market, and you have to sell.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely right. And in order to do that, I started studying. I started learning how companies do it, hugely influenced by what Skyscanner were doing at the time. I think that's a story a lot of people will go back to. Learned a lot of lessons at those time, and there's probably one I would pick out is where we ended up having a sales director in for 10 months, and it was a friend of mine who I'd been to university with, and brought him into the business, probably expected him to do quite a big sales job, very relationship-based sales job. That was his experience, but also that's how I knew him at university.
Yeah.
And he came in, did a bit of that, but more wanted to build this big marketing machine for a product that probably in hindsight didn't really need it at the time. So there was this quite disconnect at the time. So that lesson for me was, if you're going to hire someone like that, don't just hire your mates, go out wider to market. Even I hope he is still speaking to me, so that's all good. But the most important thing that he left me with, and I'll be eternally grateful to him for this, was he said to me, you need to see, I know a few of the guys at Skyscanner. I went to school with a couple of them and all that, because obviously being in Edinburgh, you know how it works. And he said, you really have to see what they're doing. You really need to see what they're doing as business. And so I ended up going up there with a couple of my colleagues, and we talked to the CTO at the time. We talked to Shane, who was the CFO, and various others, and they gave us an explanation of the technology they were using. More importantly, the business model and their approach and everything else. It was just fantastic to be exposed to that type of thinking. And I think that there'll be a number of technology companies in and around Scotland, Edinburgh and Scotland, who will say the same thing about whether it's Skyscanner or other people that have influenced them. But for me, that sent me on the direction of, ultimately I need to be in a position to work on the business rather than in the business.
That's a phrase we hear a lot. What does that mean to you?
It means we've got to the size now where we have, 34 people in the business at the moment, soon to be 40. So we're going hiring again. So if anybody wants to come and talk to us, please do. It means hiring. So I have a senior team now of, I think there's 5 or 6 in the senior team. Each of them have a specialism. So so we've divided it into sales, marketing, sales, commercial, marketing, technology, product stroke data. We've merged those 2 departments, and people. Yeah. So each of them are experts in what they do. They are better at me. They are better than me at what they do.
So that's an interesting flip, isn't it? That idea of hiring people who are better. That's sometimes that's quite a tough thing to do. To A, identify and admit it, and B, to sort of find the right person who, rather than you telling them what to do, they're telling you what to do, I assume?
It's the Steve Jobs quote, isn't it? It's we don't hire the best people and tell them what to do. They tell us what to do. And again, exactly. That came from obviously I read Steve Jobs' biography, the Walter Isaacson one, a few years ago, and that again, that was a quote in there somewhere, and it's obviously been passed around the internet, and I think that's brilliant.
It's a challenge though sometimes, because sometimes you also want to grow your own team, so you might have people internally that can grow into senior management leadership roles. And I always struggled with that balance between bringing people in. I would be the first to admit that I got it slightly wrong. I probably would, in Dogfish, my former company, I probably had a little bit too much reliance on potential rather than absolute experience. How do you make that balance?
A few months or a couple of years ago, it was I have a couple of people in the business who I think were working at the senior level, but actually they weren't probably really going to scale with it to the extent we needed. So everybody on my senior team has been with the business just over 3 years, I think is the latest one. The whole thing just changed and evolved. It was just a natural fit at the time. And I think that, and I think you and I both know that's not a bad thing, but actually bringing those people with you on that, because sometimes they scale out, they hit a ceiling. It's your fault. It's not their fault. Again, some of it probably is your fault because you're not managing it properly. You're not communicating properly. You're just hoping they evolve and don't get too ambitious because you'd rather have somebody else.
There's an opportunity, isn't there? There's an opportunity that you can miss sometimes with people. Yeah, that you it's great growing your own talent, and I'm a massive believer in growing your own talent as well. But there's an opportunity cost of not bringing in somebody who can lead from experience, etc. Sometimes.
The two members of staff I'm thinking about at the moment are both absolutely critical to the business, both in different ways. We've got one on the kind of customer facing side, another one on kind of in the internal side, and both of them know where all the bodies are buried. They know how the business works. They are hugely valuable to what we do, but in terms of the skill set required to operate at different levels of the business, sometimes in a strategic leadership role, it just needs a different type of skill set, and some people have that and some don't.
And that becomes your role to assemble that
Yes.
team.
Yeah.
It's that idea, as you grow through your business, your role changes substantially.
Yes.
You talked in the very early days about being an account manager, customer facing, and then you talked about running the data side or whatever. So how's your role changed?
It's evolved massively. It's become, I suppose, over time, far less operational.
Yeah.
And more strategic. I have to delegate a lot more.
So empowering other people.
Yeah. So again, reading a lot of the methodology and talking to people, see how others have done it, is saying, okay, well, what's going to work for me? What's going to work for us? But I think it's having the confidence to be able to do that, hand over the things that pay your wages. It's the and there's been times over the years where I think that there was a lot of insecurity. There was a lot of confidence. I think when I go back to 6 or 7 years ago, the business was functionally working, but as a leadership team, we weren't working together. And I had almost an epiphanal moment where my business partner had to drag me to one side and say, "Look, stop doing this, do all of that." I had to have the confidence to let go of the things I was doing.
Yeah.
And that sometimes is quite difficult for people. So I would say that as a co-founder, you need to be the most important relationship you've got probably is with your co-founder, because they will give you the confidence to go into everything that you need to do.
What have you seen as the advantages of co-founding, or indeed maybe some of the pitfalls?
The advantages are validation, and it's validation with somebody or more than one person of what you were doing and your idea. It's the sounding board. It's the continual. It's the it's that agreement or otherwise, and discussion and getting things talked through, getting somebody who understands you, understands where you're trying to get to as a business, and being able to challenge that. And I'm a very expressive outward thinker, so I would like to put stuff on the wall and talk things through and get challenged about it. And Richard's very good at doing that with me. As are my senior team, and I expect that from them. I don't hire people and then expect them to say yes to me all the time. I think that would be absolutely horrific, and sounds like an awful place to be.
And your skill sets are quite different, aren't they? You talked about him being an accountant, a sort of more analytical, that sort of thing. Does that help?
There's times I'd probably say I feel it doesn't, and then when I think it through and I understand where he's coming from, then yes, it does. I think. If you were two of exactly the same personality types or character types, I think it would be very, very difficult. I mean, opposites attract, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I think that he has a bunch of skills that I don't, but the two of us actually, function very well together. And interestingly for me, Richard's about 15 years older than me, and is he's the majority shareholder, so he's the investor. So
Yes.
And I think a lot of things worked. A lot of things got sorted in my head when I realized, Richard is the investor. Ultimately, it's up to him, how this goes. So therefore, once I got that right in my head, it became a much easier set of conversations. So I knew that he could challenge me. He was allowed to challenge me. I was allowed to push back. But ultimately, I needed that point of authority. I've obviously got my wife and my family as well, but everybody needs somebody to be accountable to.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement, and that's also touching on the power of investors. So you haven't taken external investment from anyone else, no. So it's the nearest you've got to an investor as well.
Yeah.
But actually, interestingly, when people take investors, that having that somebody to answer to can be a challenge, but it can also be a positive. As founders, having input. You talk about learning. It sounds like you're a lifelong learning person. You do a lot of peer-to-peer. You went to Skyscanner. You read books. Etc. But we can learn from our investors, stroke co-founders. We're constantly learning and we're constantly understanding stuff from different angles. So
exactly. And he'd run the business for 10 years before me. He's a qualified chartered accountant. He knows there's a lot of stuff he knows that I never learned.
Numbers people are worth the weight in gold as well.
A good CFO, and that's probably another learning for any founders listening. A good CFO is worth their weight in gold, and we've been privileged. It's been very easy for me over the years because he knows down to the nearest pound where everything is.
That's interesting because you often start as a founder. You start your journey. Let's say you're not financially back. I'm not a financial person. In fact, anyone who's worked with me knows that I'm way away from the finances. And I brought in an invoice clerk, and then we eventually built it up to a financial manager, stroke financial director. It took quite a long time to get there, but actually there may be merit in, well, if you take by default you had a finance director straight away. That maybe that's something that people could look at and go, would that add value very quickly to me if I took that step, rather than thinking of it as a back office function, thinking of it as a front office sort of function as well.
It's also he also has an aversion to banks.
Okay.
He will not where I can avoid it. So the business has always had cash.
Yes.
It's always been run prudently. We've never taken external equity investment. We've never taken loans from banks, and that mindset. There's two ways of looking at that. One is that you're under complete control and you're not beholden to anybody else. And I think, and that's really, that's really positive because for founders who don't know that, is there a danger in the early stage that if they don't have the right financial advice, they could get taken advantage of?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Or and that screws things up for years.
But it's, I think when you look at, I remember chatting in our scale-up cohort that I was part of, and we were talking about raising funds and talking about funding businesses, and everyone immediately latched on to equity, and we had a fantastic conversation about raising equity and blah blah blah, etc. And then somebody turned around and said, one guy said, "Has anyone ever raised debt finance?" No, but one person in the room of 20 people had raised debt finance. And we then had an hour's conversation about debt finance because nobody had thought about that as an option. And it is specifically for certain companies. Actually, funnily enough, for your organisation, should you have needed it, because you had revenue from Forth, you could have taken debt finance. So the options are there for if you're running another business. I'm not saying on the side, but if you've got another business already running. So I think people often get narrowed down into this. We must raise. Yes, I think raising can accelerate growth massively, but it doesn't always have to. And you're an example where it hasn't needed to.
The thing I think about is that Foresight now competes with there's some European vendors out there, but there's some large US ones, and they are, I think, they're certainly VC backed, if not private equity. So we deal with some really big well financed companies. We can find ways around them because we're agile. We can find ways around them because of how we focus on things and focus on different things, how they do. The smaller guys can always find a way, but it always sits in the back of my head thinking, well, what if we'd gone and raised, $10 million a few years ago?
Would you have gone further quicker?
Would we have gone further faster? Was the market ready for it? I'm not sure a lot of the market was ready for it. In some ways, but in other ways, the hotel technology space has always taken a long time to evolve and change. Arguably as well, hotel IT people don't, hotel IT budgets are not like you would see in financial services, for example, so that there is less money going around. I think COVID has probably changed that in terms of staff challenges and desire for automation, contactless, things like that. So there's a huge amount of change going on in the space at the moment, and therefore I'm expecting to see more investment money pile in, which I think will be very good timing for us. Yeah, no, there's a couple of things there. It's interesting. I think there is a lot of money going into hospitality and the hotel sector, or starting to. I think part of it is because it needs to, because of the hit they've had over the past couple of years or so. But then there's a realization because of what's been achieved in the last couple of years, isn't it?
So, and if you guys out there, if you want to chat more about the subjects raised in this podcast or hear about future episodes and the guests that we'll be speaking to, then please join the discussion at www.founder.scot. You can also follow us on Twitter at FounderDotScot, so Founder.Scot, but FounderDotScot. On LinkedIn at Founder.Scot. Instagram the same, and then on YouTube at FounderDotScot. Those links will be posted below, and thank you all very much, and goodbye.